At this point, I'm introducing one of the key concepts in the course, which is the idea of communitas. So just to point out, this is different than community. So Victor Turner used the Latin as a way to demarcate it from just a regular form of community. His idea of communitas has a very specific connotation, and I'm going to be trying to tease out some of those ideas in this section of the lecture, where I'll be building on aspects of your reading and from the written lecture. Victor Turner is one of the towering figures in pilgrimage studies. You'd be hard-pressed to not come across him when you start to research in this field. He and his wife Edith Turner both wrote on ritual, symbolism, and pilgrimage, and are still very, very important thinkers in this field. So Turner was born in Scotland in 1920. He's clearly a very interesting person, and his academic career was disrupted by the Second World War, and he was a conscientious objector, but he served as somebody who did bomb disposal, so that's probably one of the most dangerous jobs you can do. So he clearly was a very courageous person, but was opposed to violence. And so he eventually converted to, along with his wife, to Roman Catholicism. And this seemed to make him particularly interested in Catholic modes of building up society and in ritual practices such as pilgrimage. So we find with Turner, and I think this is one of the reasons, besides the fact that his writing, he has a very interesting style of writing, he also clearly has a lot of sympathy for religious people, as he himself was religious. And so Turner really offers an edic and an emic perspective, an insider-outsider perspective in his work that I think makes it particularly interesting. So I'm drawing from the book The Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure, which was published in 1969, and your reading in your course pack comes from this book. So Turner was an anthropologist, and he built on the work of a number of different anthropologists. And in terms of developing his idea of communitas, he built particularly on the Dutch-French anthropologist Van Gennep's work. So I go into this in some detail in the written part of the lecture, his ideas of rites of passage. And so Van Gennep talked about the idea that when people are moving from one position in society to another, so say they're moving from adolescence to adulthood, typically cultures and religions have rituals at this point that help them move to the next stage. But before they do that, they're in what he calls a liminal state. They're betwixt and between these roles. And so they're neither one thing nor the other. And so Turner focuses on this particular moment and builds it out in his theory. So he relates it to particular styles of human relationship, which can happen at certain times, and also he particularly focuses on the way that this communitas can develop on pilgrimage. So he develops the idea of communitas as a modality of social relationship. So it's a very particular type of social relationship that has its own characteristics. It's important to note that Turner developed his theories by observing pilgrimage and also participating in it, and so in places like Mexico, and was able to actually see how this develops. So he developed this idea of the characteristics of liminality, and I've only used a few here. He has a longer list than this, but these are some of the key ones that I've pulled out of what makes something liminal, betwixt and between. So the idea of transition, so the idea that the person is in a moment or state of transition from one perhaps role to another. The idea of anonymity, and again, this is where it also links to tourism and travel in general, that when we travel abroad, at least if we go alone, there's a sense of anonymity. No one knows our background, no one knows our history the way they might in our place of origin. The next characteristic is simplicity. So by its very nature, when we travel or when we go on pilgrimage, everything is simplified. You're carrying everything on your back. And so life becomes stripped down from, taking us away from a lot of the minutiae and detail of our day-to-day life and surroundings. absence of rank. So related to anonymity, people don't necessarily know anything about where we are in the structure of society unless we tell them. And so there is that sense, I think many of us have felt this when we're traveling, of almost you could reinvent yourself. There's nobody knows your actual history or where you sit in that social ranking system. And so in pilgrimage, we see this is very important, that breaking down of social stratification and that everybody is equal. Nakedness or uniformity of clothing, that should say or. And so in rites of passage, in some cultures, the person is actually naked, but typically in practices like pilgrimage, we find a uniformity of clothing. So traditionally, the pilgrim would wear very specific types of clothing that would make them look the same as all the other pilgrims. And actually, if you look at how people dress when they travel, there is a weird kind of quasi-uniform that people wear. And so the idea that you're not standing out, you're not offering any evidence of your usual self, your usual professional clothing, etc. In your reading, Turner talks about ideological versus spontaneous communitas. And so throughout history, there have been various attempts across culture to create what I would call utopian communities, where communitas is the nature of that social interaction all the time. And based on, he looks at Buber's idea, the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber's idea of the I-thou relationship, this very deep relationship that's based on the authentic self. And so utopian communities across time have tried to develop structures that allow for real, authentic relationship that isn't just based on our sort of social persona. And so he uses the example of monastic communities as creating permanent liminality. So he looks at the Franciscans, and so the idea that if we look at monastic communities, whether they're Buddhist or Christian or Hindu, the people participating in them don't have property. They tend to dress very simply. They don't possess wealth, and so on. And so all these markers of who we are socially and how we're socially ranked by, for instance, our possessions or our amounts of money, these are swept away. So monastic communities, in some sense, are attempting to create permanent communitas that allows for that authentic relationship, both with each other and with the divine. In your reading, Turner gives a number of different examples of the way that communitas is facilitated across culture. I'm adding in one here that I'm pulling out of my course on ritual and material practice. So festivals and holidays are often constructed, at least partly, as a time where communitas can kind of creep in. So if we look particularly at more ecstatic holidays, so if we look at Holi in the Hindu tradition, which is where often people are very intoxicated and they're throwing water and colored powder on each other, and it's a very ecstatic practice. So the sort of structures of society tend to break down, often with some rather comical results. And this, I'll just give a really obvious example from our culture, Christmas parties. So pre-COVID, these were notorious for people doing something embarrassing. And so the idea that we do structure into our year times where we can lift off a lot of the pressure and structure off of people so that they can be their authentic self. Now, their authentic self, if it gets too out of hand, can get them fired, but usually it doesn't go that far, or arrested. But that doesn't usually happen except at St. Patrick's Day at Western University. But so that idea that there is a recognition that people need periods where they get a break from all these structures of responsibility and obligation. Another area that cultures tend to build in where communitas can be fostered is through ecstatic poetry and music, and he gives a number of examples in your reading, and then he ties it back to some of the musicians of the 1960s counterculture, such as Bob Dylan. And the countercultural experiments of the 1960s and early 70s are a very interesting example of attempts at communitas. Now, they also demonstrate pretty clearly that it's often almost impossible to create a community based on communitas. It's by its nature spontaneous because somebody has to do the work and somebody has to do the dishes and do the cooking and so on. So I remember somebody locally whose parents were part of the Back to the Land movement, which was a kind of a quasi-hippie movement that was very popular apparently around this area of the North in Ontario. And she said almost every single marriage broke down because, again, it's a very optimistic, very utopian idea that we can live in communitas, but reality starts to creep in, and how do you support that monetarily and so on. And so typically, as Turner points out, religions and cultures build it in at certain points in the year, and then it has to end, and then you go back to your social role. So I wanted to end with this quote from Turner: "Wisdom is always to find the appropriate relationship between structure and communitas." So he's looking at the way that religions structure in this idea of the appropriate relationship between structure and communitas, structure and spontaneity and so on. So there's a recognition that human beings need both. And so I'm using this as a way to theorize pilgrimage. And so pilgrimage can, obviously it's not guaranteed to happen, but it definitely facilitates this, that pilgrimage allows for a quite sustained time of communitas in a lot of cases. And so people will often talk, and this is true of travel in general, of the very intense friendships that were created while they were on the road. And so as we move through the course, I want you to be paying attention, using this theory as a kind of lens to look at different forms of pilgrimage. And do you think Turner is correct in his theories around communitas and pilgrimage? Now, I realize this is a fairly complex theory, and so if you have any questions about it, please reach out to me and we can go over it.